Easter Rising of 1960.
The Easter Rising took place on the 24th of April 1916, and it was an armed uprising organised by the IRB against British rule in Ireland. While it would ultimately fail in the end, it did light the fuse for what would become Irish independence in the future from Britain, and this was the first step towards an Irish republic. But how did it happen? The first cause of the Easter Rising was the impact of World War I. Now, World War I's timing provided the opportunity for Ireland to stage a rebellion while Britain's focus was concentrated on the European conflict. Clark and McDermott said that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, and they saw this as an opportunity to stage an armed rebellion against Britain. Now, previously, Home Rule acted as an umbrella ideology which accommodated moderate nationalists who saw Home Rule as the limit of their ambitions, but it also accommodated more radical nationalists who saw it as the first step to full Irish independence. Now, Home Rule was not enacted at the start of the First World War, as it was suspended, and it was quoted to be a check continuously post-dated by McDermott, and it led to questioning among more moderate nationalists about Redmond's support for the war, which he delivered at the Wooden Bridge speech in September the 20th, 1914. Redmond delivered his speech at Wooden Bridge, where he encouraged volunteers to serve wherever the firing line may extend. Now, 20 members of the original 27-man committee issued a statement ridiculing Redmond's new policy, and McNeill disagreed with Redmond in supporting Britain for the war, as he realised that it would not advance the nationalist cause in Ireland. And it led to a split in the Irish volunteers, with 158,000 men being loyal to Redmond, but there were 12,000 more radical members under McNeill, and these 12,000 could be used in future by the IRB to stage a rising, which they did in Easter 1916.
Feeling frustrations, those who choose to fight for Britain and Ireland
were recognised in the 10th and 16th Irish Divisions. However, they were not fully recognised by the War Office, as they were not given their own badges or emblems, and this was in contrast to the 36th Ulster Division, which was formed just for Ulster Unionists, and they were given their own badges and their own emblems, which closely resembled the emblem of the UVF, whereas nationalists were not given this by the War Office. Kitchener failed to put the nationalists on an equal footing with the unionists, which added to resentment, as many of the nationalist fighters were scattered throughout the English divisions. Now, once the war started, Asquith actually offered Redmond a position on his wartime cabinet. However, Redmond rejected due to the IPP's tradition of independent parliamentary action. However, a position on the cabinet was given to Carson, which further looked like Ulster Unionists were undermining Home Rule, and they would have more of a sway in the government, which further undermined Redmond. Another cause of the Easter Rising was Ulster resistance. Carson's extra-parliamentary strategy encouraged militant nationalism. Ulster Unionists obtaining 26,000 rifles from German ships paved the way for militant nationalism to do the same thing. And it seemed to nationalists that the only way to get government concessions, as the Ulster Unionists had demonstrated, was by the use of force or the use of violence. And Owen McNeill took inspiration from Carson's tactics, which contrasted sharply to Redmond's more constitutional methods of gaining concessions, which had seemed not to work so far for the nationalist cause. And Owen McNeill also took inspiration from the article "The North Began," had in fact knocked the bottom out of Ulster Unionism. Many believe that Carsonism actually converted a number of moderate nationalists from Home Rulers to more radical nationalists, and many historians believe that Carson had put the gun back into Irish politics. Patrick Pearse went under this transformation from going through a Home Ruler to a more radical nationalist, and he took part in the 1916 Easter Rising. Carsonism had actually boosted the old Fenian traditions of force, which together with the new nationalism which was being revived in the early 20th century came together, which fueled new Irish traditions.
I am glad the North has begun, because it's a good thing to see guns in Irish hands. New nationalism, also known as the Gaelic Revival, began to take hold in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. It is the revival of old Irish traditions and culture. The ancient Irish language came back into effect as the Gaelic League revived in 1893. The Gaelic Athletic Association was refounded in 1884 and organised Irish traditional sports such as hurling and Gaelic football. In 1906, it reached the peak of its influence with 985 branches. With GAA 75,000 members, it had huge influence on Irish culture, but it also began to have a huge influence on politics as it was politicised by IRB infiltrators who wanted to use it as a tool to peddle their ideals of Irish independence. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was an underground and secret organisation which sought to give birth to an Irish independent republic. They used their influence in these organisations during the Gaelic revival to peddle new blood into the IRB, which had become dysfunctional due to its failures in the past. Veteran Fenian Tom Clark recruited these new men, such as Patrick Pearse, Plunkett and MacDonagh, to come into the IRB, revitalise it and allow Irish independence to take a new form. The IRB was intent on a rising, planning for this in August 1914. However, they had not set a date for it yet and preferred to use the opportunity whenever it came to them. The IRB then infiltrated the Irish volunteers. They wanted to use this connection to have the manpower necessary to stage a rising. However, they didn't leave these intentions out in the open just yet. McNeill was kept in the dark about their true intentions. This would be seen again and again, such as during the Castle document, actually just before the rising. In September 1915, the IRB appointed its military council with big names such as Clark, Pearse, McDermott and Plunkett. MacDonagh and Connolly would also be added to this later on. Now these men were very important to the rising's character. Connolly, although a socialist, believed that
For Ireland to free itself from capitalism, it must first free itself from Britain.
many poets such as MacDonagh were also in on it, and Plunkett as well. Pearse, however, took the main ideas of the rising and turned them up to 11. Pearse believed wholly in a blood sacrifice. He believed that Ireland had to be saved, and the IRB would have to sacrifice themselves in order to save it. He is obsessed with this ideology, likening himself at times to Jesus Christ to save Ireland in Easter 1916.
The date for the rising was selected for Easter Sunday 1916, as it was believed by those who were planning the rising that it was going to take a sacrifice to save Ireland from British oppression, like Jesus Christ's sacrifice. And the date was also selected as it was considered the day that this could be the resurrection of Ireland from British rule.
On the 16th of April 1916, the Aud, which was a German ship carrying 20,000 rifles to be used in the rising, was sunk by British forces. This removed any chance of a successful rebellion for the rebels, and Roger Casement was later arrested as he was trying to procure German prisoners of war to come and fight for Ireland against the British. However, this did not deter the military council. While it did remove any chance of having a successful rebellion, they fell back on Pearse's idea of a blood sacrifice. The IRB forged the Castle document on April the 19th, which laid out supposed plans from the British government to try and suppress the volunteers. This somewhat convinced McNeill to go ahead with the rising with the IRB, but he soon learned that this was forgery by the IRB.
Sir, what's this? So that's not real. The British aren't coming. He's lied to you. That's not real. There's nothing happening. He's using you to get the volunteers, sir. That's not. Stop the rising! Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
McNeill would then put forward his counter-order, which stated that his volunteers should not participate in the rising. But despite this, the rising went ahead with only 1,600 insurgents.
The rising's not off. We're going ahead. We don't need the volunteers. We don't need casement.
Yes, sir.
We need a sacrifice!
All of our people, sir.
The rising went ahead on Easter Monday, the 24th of April. The IRB leaders knew that it was doomed to fail militarily. Not only were the rebels small in number, they lacked adequate arms since the German weapons which Roger Casement had planned to land on the Kerry coast had been captured by the British. The rebels occupied key buildings in Dublin, including the General Post Office in O'Connell Street. Standing outside the General Post Office, Pearce read out the Proclamation of Independence, signed by all 7 members of the military council, to a bemused crowd of onlookers. The insurgents held defensive points with artillery and waited for government forces to dislodge them. They managed to hold out for 6 days before surrendering. After all, some 400 people were killed during the rising, including 300 civilians, and 1,000 people were wounded.
Initially, the people of Ireland, and more specifically the people of Dublin, were incredibly hostile to this rise. Left Dublin decimated, with close to 200 buildings flattened by British artillery. Despite this decimation, and what could have easily been swept under the rug as an insignificant event, the British reaction is what gives the Easter Rising its power. Firstly, they labelled it the Sinn Féin Rising, despite the fact that Sinn Féin had very little to do with the rising, if anything at all. Hundreds were interned and sent to camps in England and Wales, especially Frongoch, which became known as the University of Revolution, as these Sinn Féin men spread their ideals to one another and only became more and more radical. General Maxwell was sent in by the British to take control of the situation, but he made many critical errors. Firstly, he imposed martial law on all of Ireland, which only confused the people of Ireland and perhaps stirred up some anti-British sentiment. Execution of key rising leaders. 14 men in total would be executed. After 12 had been executed, Dillon and Redmond pleaded with the government to stop the execution. Of James Connolly, the last man to be murdered. However, they refused to do this, and instead continued with these executions, which only drove sympathy for the men. This made them martyrs for the rising, martyrs for Ireland. They had achieved what they wanted in a blood sacrifice. 3 journalists, including Sheafy Skeffington, would be killed. Skeffington's murder in particular caused uproar amongst many Irishmen, as he himself was a pacifist journalist and had shot down all of his accusations of violence. He had even reported. The actions of the British government served to be a huge blow for the IPP. They were tied directly to the government's actions after the Wooden Bridge speech, and the murder of these revolutionaries set a precedent and undermined the IPP. They had pleaded in Parliament. A cult of these dead leaders soon began to develop. Many of them had converted to Catholicism on their deathbeds and had been given their last rites. This added a moral responsibility to the rising. Pictures of Patrick Pearce sat alongside
The Easter Rising of 1916.
Get out of here! The Easter Rising of 1916 was a complete failure. They couldn't hold out in Dublin, they couldn't hold out for the people couldn't stand them. They were booed when they were sent to England and Wales. The Easter Rising had no significance. The only significance the Easter Rising could ever have was due to the British response. The British response had been to execute 15 people, but I mean, what's the real problem with that?
The rising itself may have been a failure, but what this would do is it would lay the foundations for more radical nationalism. And while the British government did label it the Sinn Féin Rising, it failed, but Sinn Féin would rise again, and the radical nationalism would develop, which would be resulted in Sinn Féin's victory in the 1918 general election.